So Jack and Sarah, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode where we're taking a look at real-time payments. And it's certainly very interesting because the Federal Reserve came out with further announcements in terms of their progress of their FedNow real-time payments rail and what it is that they're going to be doing about that. But a couple of the questions, and the first one that I've got off the back here, and Jack, if we could start with you. Given that everything that's going on with COVID-19 and kind of the initial pressures of being able to develop a faster real-time payments rail here, do you feel that the Federal Reserve is going to kind of give in, so to speak, a little bit to that pressure and perhaps kind of expedite the timeline that they've given in terms of releasing FedNow?
Well, it may be a counter statement to make, but I'm not sure that they're going to go any faster. And you say, well, why is that? Back in August of 2019, when the Federal Reserve announced that they were going to go forward with what is now called FedNow, they requested comments from all interested parties. Well, the comments came in, and particularly from small to middle-sized banks, it was almost universal that, well, Federal Reserve, you said in 2019 that you're going to have FedNow into production in 2023, 2024. We want you to go faster. And that was emphasized. And it must have made an impact because there were multiple spots in the announcement that the Federal Reserve made just earlier this month that said, we're going to try to go faster. We're going to try to expedite the release of the first version of FedNow because we hear you. We hear what you want. So I think with the COVID-19 pandemic, I think that'll certainly underscore the urgency of getting a new system out. But I don't know they're going to be able to go any faster. They've already declared themselves as trying to expedite the release of the first version of FedNow. I don't know if they'll go any faster than they're already planning to. I mean, it is the government now. So I think that they will go faster if they can.
Yeah, so I think that that's certainly a fair point there. Just with it, I think, yeah, to your point that, hey, they were initially asked, can you please go a little bit faster? And I think it's kind of interesting because on the announcement that you were talking about there on August 6th, that the Federal Reserve made, they were talking about the core functionality, right? That they were going to unveil FedNow kind of in phases to hopefully get things going faster on their end, kind of releasing it in kind of the same way you would release software in terms of, okay, here's the core functionality, and then let's add additional bolts on top of it. So let's talk about that core functionality. Like what can the payments ecosystem expect to be kind of that core functionality on that initial release?
Well, let's go back again to 2019 and the announcement that FedNow was actually going to go forward. That whole effort was going to be underwritten by the Federal Reserve. They announced a set of functions and features that they would like to have as part of the overall FedNow functionality, but now they've got the impetus to try to get something in place as quickly as possible. So the issue becomes a balancing act between getting a system that has critical mass. You don't want to put out a system that really can't do anything because it doesn't have enough componentry. So they've had to balance critical mass of functionality against speed of delivery. So some things went in that they talked about in 2019, some things did not. But some of the main things, which I think are going to be of importance, to just about any potential user of FedNow services. First of all, it will be an instant payment provider. This is a new term that the Federal Reserve has settled on. Not fast payments, not faster payments, not real-time payments, instant payments. And what that means is that if you're transferring funds from Bank A to Bank B, that funds transfer operation is going to take place within a period of seconds. And as part of the FedNow regulations, the recipient bank has got to deposit those funds into the recipient's individual account within seconds. So the whole process, including initiation, settlement, will in fact take place in a matter of seconds. So they call that instant payments, and that's going to be a feature of the first release. Clearing and settlement will be part of that. as part of the individual transaction. So they won't be follow-on steps. They will be part of the payment transfer itself. And what that means is that once the payment has successfully completed, it's irrevocable. It's final. The recipient has access to those funds and they're unrestricted. It is going to be available 24/7 by 365. That was one of the tenets outlined in the task force that the Federal Reserve assembled and was also announced in 2019. They did say that certainly for the first release that all of the payments are going to be credit push. There's not going to be any debit pull payments. So a potential recipient of funds isn't going to be able to reach into the account of a potential payer and withdraw those funds. Every individual payment transfer has got to be authorized by the payer. The Federal Reserve said we may never have debit pull type transactions, but we recognize there's value in that functional capability. So what they have included is a request for payment message that a potential recipient of funds can issue a request for payment to a potential payer who can either say, all right, I'll pay you, and then transfer those funds or not. But the payer will be in control of each individual transaction. FedNow is only going to be available to banks that maintain reserve accounts with the Federal Reserve. So issuers and recipients of payments have to have Federal Reserve accounts with the Federal Reserve. Liquidity options. This is kind of interesting. The Federal Reserve is going to make available in FedNow some of the liquidity tools that are available currently. So you can have intraday credit, which is, and currently it's called daylight overdraft. So a bank can temporarily go under its minimum reserve requirements during the course of the day as long as they make up the position by close of business. They're going to allow discount window loans, so you can borrow money from the Federal Reserve to maintain your reserve account, but it's only going to be available for a portion of the week. It won't be available on the weekend. So what are you going to do when you're a smaller bank? You're used to banker's hours, if you will. Now you've got to maintain operations 24/7 by 365, and you run out of funds to support a payment that's being made out of an account on your bank. On the weekend, right now, you're stuck. So the Federal Reserve recognized that, so they created what they call a liquidity management tool. I wouldn't call it a tool, I just call it a procedure, but anyway, it's their name and that's what they call it. Essentially, what they're going to do is, I don't know how this is going to work. I really looked for details in the Federal Reserve announcement. I didn't see it. But if you are a bank and you now have deficient reserve funds, you can get a bank with surplus reserve funds to transfer funds into your reserve account, thereby getting you above the minimum requirement for reserve level. I don't know how that's going to work. I don't know how it's going to be funded. Do you borrow money? And so what is the rate? Who's going to be part of this pool of lenders and borrowers? They didn't say. So that will come out as later information. Small banks, getting back to the issue of they're used to maintaining banker's hours and not 24/7 by 365. So how are they going to support a payment network that operates this way? Federal Reserve acknowledged, yes, that's an issue. So what they have allowed is they will allow agents and service providers to directly interface with FedNow and actually act as a buffer between smaller banks, or any bank for that matter, and actually conducting business with FedNow. So the service provider will provide the 24/7 by 365 service. They'll maintain liquidity amounts based on some kind of procedure that's been agreed to between the service provider and each individual bank that the service provider is supporting. So it won't be the individual smaller banks that are having to do all of this. You'll actually have a service provider that provides the function. Lesser issues, They're only going to allow domestic transfers. In other words, you can't have cross-border transfers, at least yet. They're going to be using the standard that everybody's using for fast payment standards, ISO 20022. They are going to provide, in response to some requests in the comments, for some fraud tools, basically reports and some statistics that banks can use to identify suspicious trends, suspicious transfers, suspicious volumes, and so forth. One of the things that I found, and this is an extension to your question, are some functions and features that people requested that aren't going to be part of Release 1. And one of the things that was requested by a broad assortment of potential users of FedNow is an alias or a proxy directory. They wanted right now, if you want to transfer funds to somebody, a P2P transfer, you have to know the bank that the recipient's account is on. You have to know the account number. This is not something that's easy to memorize. So a number of fast payment systems around the world, what they've allowed is proxies that can be used that are more easily remembered, like cell phone numbers or email addresses. And you can use that to specify a payment destination. And then the payment network provides a mapping from that to the actual bank and account number. The Federal Reserve said there's lots of questions here. We can't get this done in time for expedited delivery of FedNow, so we're postponing that. We'll have it, but not yet. There's not going to be an API, an application programming interface, that's available as far as the first release. And what this is going to do is service providers that might want to provide some valuable overlay services aren't going to be able to do that as part of the first release. That will be coming later. Again, the Federal Reserve said, there's some complicated questions here. We got to think about it a while. It's not going to be available in the first release. I think the biggest thing out of all this that's not going to be there, and it's reasonable that it's not, is the issue of interoperability. When FedNow comes online, you're going to have two major fast payment networks in the United States. You're going to have RTP, you're going to have FedNow. The question then is, well, I've got an account on a bank in RTP that wants to transfer funds to an account on a bank on FedNow. You can't do that. And equally as important, you can't settle it. So because both networks are going to have to be involved in the settlement process. And I know the Federal Reserve would love to have some kind of portal, some kind of rule of the road to interchange messages with RTP. RTP is not interested. They're going to have to be dragged to the negotiating table to come up with something that will work. So anyway, quite naturally, they don't have that figured out yet. So that's a long-winded answer to your question of the functions and features that are going to be there. It's quite a list, but there are quite a few other things that people have indicated they wanted that are going to be deferred until a later release of FedNow. But it does have critical mass. You definitely are going to be able to do baseline account-to-account transfers when the dust settles. And that is, bottom line, the least that you need to be able to do in an instant payment network.
I think that was probably the best summary of what the Fed had to say in their webinar, plus what was in the Federal Register that I have ever seen. If I could dig into just a couple of these points. The request for pay solution that you talked about, I thought that was kind of interesting, that was one of the things that's going to make it into the early to market features of FedNow. Now, I understand that what the Fed is going to be building is really the messaging capability. They're not building the end product, right? We still need technology providers and processors and financial institutions themselves to be able to sort of embed that capability within their user interfaces, correct?
Oh, that's correct. But you know, if you talk to the RTP people, they say, we're plumbing. We don't provide all of the overlay services. We're the plumbing. You use us as plumbing, and the rest of it is up to you. So FedNow is saying much the same thing. You're absolutely correct.
Yeah, yeah. Do you see, what do you think are some of the biggest use cases there with that request for pay, which really, as you stated, bridges the gap for the fact that we don't have debit capabilities? Is that mostly in sort of the bill pay world, do you think?
I think so. You know, when I see that, I think of utility services. They send out a bunch of bills at the end of each month or whatever, and they send out typically paper invoices wanting people to pay for their electricity, whatever, and people write checks. Well, some people are theorizing that with the request to pay capability, that will serve as the invoice, and then the instant payment will be the response to that. And I think that makes some sense. As an example, my organization currently is putting in a national payments network in Portugal. And one of the major use cases that's been identified for that payment network is the ability for consumers to pay their water bills. In that particular case, not only are they supporting request to send, but they're also supporting debit pull type transactions as well, depending on the relationship that the consumer has set up with his or her bank. So it goes both ways in that particular case, but request to pay allows them to do that if you don't have debit pull.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Yeah. You know, I do think as I think about what's being built, you know, there's still going to be a lot of work for financial institutions. You know, once this gets built, this is really just the beginning. And, you know, for a lot of these institutions, as you pointed out, particularly the smaller ones, moving to a 24/7, 365 environment is going to, you know, facilitate the need for a lot of work. And, you know, it's not just building the product, but maintaining the system. And, you know, we haven't even touched really upon the fraud concerns that need to be covered. So what do you think the long-term sort of tail of this looks like? How long is it going to take us to really populate real-time and faster payments throughout financial institutions?
Well, longer than I think a lot of people realize. And I'm basing that assessment on the experiences that banks have had trying to build portals into RTP. I mean, Huntington Bank is deliberately set up their implementation effort on a phased basis, just because, well, it's a big chunk of stuff. It hasn't been done, certainly by individual organizations, so they're kind of feeling their way. I think you can, if you don't know exactly how you're going to do it, I think that the protocol and the message set in RTP, and the same way will occur in FedNow, is very precise, it's defined, you know what it is. The problem is building all the back office functions as part of your organization to be able to properly interact and use those messages to achieve some useful purpose. So I think as, you know, applications coming out, I think the first applications you're really going to see are the ones that are easier to put in. And that's going to be things like P2P payments, basic transfer from account A to account B. So I think that's going to be the start, just if no other reason, that it takes people, it takes organizations, both banks and businesses, time to go ahead and build the back office structures that are needed to interact with these big payment networks.
Yeah, one other point I wanted to make, I think you're right on about the issue of interoperability. We could probably spend, you know, another session talking just about how to achieve interoperability. We absolutely, as a payments industry, need to figure that one out collectively. And I'm wondering if there aren't some intermediaries that can come to the surface, if you will, that can help to sort of bridge that gap between the two existing or soon to be two existing payment services.
Well, the correct response is this: for the two major players in this game to get together and come up with messaging that they both can agree on, so that you can effect smooth transfer of funds from one network to the other, and you can also provide the settlement messaging that will satisfy both parties. But absent that, and that's going to take time, I see there might be a role to for a third party that acts as an intermediate switch. So, okay, here I have an account transfer that I want to make. I hand it to the third party. That party figures out the kind of messaging that is appropriate for one network and the messaging that is appropriate for the other network. And so it acts as a bridge. It's not optimal, but depending on the state of negotiations and how long it takes, that might be an opportunity for a third party to come in and be useful and make a buck or two.
Yep, yep. I think that might happen.
Yeah, I certainly think so. All of that is really interesting, and I know that you kind of brought up some of the fraud tools that they're looking to implement. I mean, do you see that there could be the potential where essentially there could kind of be a bit of a feedback loop in terms of that? Okay, all these institutions are being able to then feed in all this fraud information, and then the Federal Reserve being able to turn around and then almost kind of push into their fraud management tool of being like, hey, here's kind of an updated version of it because everybody else is pushing into them. Do you see that as a possibility for one of their fraud tools that they could open up?
Well, I know that the potential users of FedNow want that. They would love to just go ahead and push the responsibility for fraud detection and assessment to the FedNow network. FedNow is kind of pushing back on that. They're saying, yeah, we understand that. That's certainly an option. People have described that. We hear you. But I think they're trying to feel their way as well. And they have announced that they will be expanding their fraud options. But I think they're taking baby steps right now. Essentially, they seem just to be data collectors, and they're going to provide that data collection to individuals. But I absolutely agree with you that if Bank A can somehow gain access to the experience of certain kind of account activity on Bank B, and they're involved somehow with transactions going to Bank B, then yes, that would alert them that there could be an issue here. But the Fed has also acknowledged, and I think with some truthfulness, that banks, financial institutions have already got fraud protections in place on their own. And they're relying on that, at least initially. So you've got some fraud tools, you keep using those fraud tools. We're going to provide you some additional information as our contribution in the beginning, but stay tuned because we'll be adding to our fraud arsenal. And I think it's probably going to be based on what they see and kind of the patterns that evolve in all of this. So I think that they probably made a wise choice, again, trying to balance out expedited delivery plus functionality. And I think this is probably a good choice because they don't have all the answers yet either.
Well, and I think really the financial institutions should know their customer. They should have a much better handle on who is sending and who is the recipient of these funds. They really should be in a much better position to manage the fraud, theoretically. And certainly I think the Fed can play a data collection role in all of this, but I think that the financial institutions certainly should bear a majority of the effort.
Sarah, you've probably seen this, and I interact with financial institutions as a supplier of software. But one of the things that you'll find financial institutions wanting to do is pass the buck. They want to cover their anatomy. So if somehow they can push the responsibility and hopefully the liability to a third party, i.e. the Federal Reserve, as being responsible for detection and signaling the incidences of fraud, I'm sure they would love it. But, the Federal Reserve is still saying, no, we're not going to be responsible. We'll help you, but you're still responsible.
Yeah, I certainly think that certainly makes a lot of sense there. So now when we're taking a look at how financial institutions need to approach instant payments or real-time payments in this instance, obviously we talked about the FedNow kind of coming out in a phased approach. Do you think that there's still kind of that same recommendation in terms of how financial institutions should approach real-time payments in terms of like a phased approach to it? Or do you think it's kind of a jumping in the water all at once?
I think if you've done it before, jump in. If you haven't done it before, you better be careful. You say, well, what do you mean? Nobody's done it before with FedNow. By the time FedNow comes out, whether it's 2023, 2024, 2022, whatever the case might be, you'll have a corpus of individuals and organizations that have gone through a somewhat similar experience with RTP. Now, even though the internal architecture is different from FedNow, functionally there's strong similarities up to a point. But I think if you've gone through the experience with RTP, you know what works, you know what doesn't work, you can bring that experience to the FedNow environment and hopefully apply it. I think, for example, some of the service providers that are going to be holding up their corporate hands and saying, use us as intermediaries, banks, they're going to be coming into FedNow with some acquired experience with RTP. So you're going to have the Van Emps and the Fiservs and the Jack Henrys that are going to be competing for banks, small or large, to act so that they can act as intermediary into FedNow. So I think the likelihood is that they may have working functionality in place before serving smaller banks, possibly before some of the larger banks are ready to go online. But on all of this, there's going to be some pacing that is imposed by the Federal Reserve. They've said, we don't have all the answers yet. We've identified most of the functions that are going to be there, but we haven't really identified a lot of the detail, certainly not for the liquidity management tool, for example. So we're going to be pushing that information as quickly as we can get it determined and as quickly as we can promulgate it. And we're also going to help by offering pilots. So hopefully banks can drive applications before they have to get on the freeway, so to speak. So they're going to do what they can do. But in terms of trying to jump in and implement a full bore application out of the get-go, I think you're going to be hindered from that because you're not going to be able to fill in all the spaces because the spaces will not have been defined and standardized by the Federal Reserve. But I think that if you've gone through the experience of putting in an application for a financial institution as RTP, you're going to be closer to being able to go ahead and architect and implement all or most of the functionality for FedNow as part of a single big project. I think for other people, they're going to be more leery and they're going to do what I think people are doing right now with RTP, and that's implementing in phases.
Yeah, I think the Fed kind of recognized that and recognizes that some institutions are going to take a phased approach because I noticed in the Federal Register that they have stated that they are certainly willing to allow financial institutions to come on as receive only, at least initially. So that can give them a little bit of practice, if you will, you know, before they roll out the full gamut of processing capabilities.
They're trying to facilitate baby steps. I absolutely agree with you. And I think, again, the pilots are supportive of that observation that we're going to let you try things up to a point before we have the application into full production. So we're going to allow you to try things out before you have to go whole hog. But you're absolutely right. They're allowing financial institutions to receive funds without having to have the capability of actually supporting payments. Payment initiation.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Jack and Sarah, for really educating myself and the audience in terms of real-time payment and instant payments now. And I hope to have both of you back on the show real soon.
Ryan, Sarah, thank you both for allowing me to participate today. Thank you.
It was a fun conversation. Thank you.